everyone, welcome to Modern Application Development Part 2.
Hello everyone. In this set of lectures, I'm going to be talking about a few different topics with relationship to the Vue framework, which is why I've titled this as Assorted Views. So the point is that Vue by itself as a framework is something that we have already seen. We know how to sort of build basic applications with it. And in order to scale up beyond that and in order to build up larger applications, there are certain other ideas and concepts that we need to understand and keep in mind. So the purpose of these lectures is primarily to sort of introduce you to those concepts, and we will be looking at some examples from the Vue Cookbook, the official source. And what I'll be doing is sort of walking through those examples in order to give you an idea of what is involved with those certain kinds of implementations. So the first thing that we want to look at is this idea of persistent storage, right? And in persistent storage, this is something that we have actually not looked at all in the context of an app so far, right? We have always considered an application, a web application, to be something where the data is stored on the server and the browser is just a client. It's a front end, right? It is something that is used by the user in order to interact with the server. But by itself, I should be able to just close the browser, either open another browser or go to another machine, and once again connect to the server, give my authorization details, whatever it is that authenticates me to the server, and continue where I left off, right? That's the sort of ideal scenario that we would like as far as a web application is concerned. But there are situations where you might want to do something beyond that. So let's try and understand what exactly we mean by persistent storage. So the first question that we can ask is, what is it, right? And as we have already seen in some examples before, anytime that I reload a web page with a Vue application in it, the Vue application basically gets initialized, right? So anytime there's a fresh load of a page, it means that the entire Vue application, the JavaScript runs through from the beginning. All the created, mounted, all of those hooks are run, which means that we are effectively starting with a new instance of that application. The problem is there are situations where I would not want that to happen. I might want to reload the page in order to basically refresh it, but I want the data that I have so far entered into it to still be retained somewhere in the system, right? I don't want to have to type everything in again, right? And as I said, the reasons why do we want something of this sort, the true persistence is usually implemented at the server, right? So for example, when I have a Gmail account, even though I'm using the Gmail web app as a front end in order to access and read my email, all the mails themselves are ultimately stored at the server, right? But there are circumstances where I might want to have some kind of local storage. One example would be, let's say I'm trying to work offline, right? Meaning that I get into an airplane to fly from one place to another. I have to switch off all connectivity on my computer, right? I would still like to be able to retrieve at least some of the old emails or look through them if necessary. And I can't do that with the regular connected web application that is the default mode of operation, which means that I should be able to work offline without requiring a server connection. Well, it's not that you always have to, but it might be a nice feature to have in certain kinds of applications. There are certain other simple applications where there is really no need to go to the server for requests. We have already looked at a couple of examples. One of them was the tic-tac-toe application. Another one was the weather update. Now in both of those cases, let's say that I wanted to keep track of how many times I have played tic-tac-toe, right? And what has been the win versus loss versus draw ratio that I have built up over time. Do I really need to have a server just to do this? If I know that I'm always going to be running on the same machine, on the same browser, maybe it makes more sense to just store it locally without even needing a server for this. The same way for the weather application, I type in a set of cities that I'm interested in. There was really no server involved in this part of the application. The server only acts to give me the data in terms of an API, and that's really all that I need, right? I should not need to have a server just for the purpose of storing which are the cities that I'm interested in. So can I store it locally and have that retrieved every time I open the browser? That would be a nice feature to have as well. And there's yet another context in which this might work, which is basically to store configuration information, right? Certain applications have some amount of local configuration for which I might find it useful to store that information locally rather than putting all of that also onto a remote server. So finally, the question becomes how? How can we store this local information? Okay, and there are at least 3 different options that are available to modern browsers. The first is cookies, right? So JavaScript, I mean the cookies by themselves are usually used by servers, right? So servers tend to set cookies which are then stored on the browser, and the idea is that every time that browser then connects to the same server, it is going to send back the cookie, which helps the server to identify something about what the nature of the client, right? Maybe the username of the person who's logged in or the list of cities that they are interested in, right? So that the server doesn't need to store anything on its own. Now, you could do it with a server, or if you are doing it with JavaScript, you might also manage to do the entire thing purely using cookies, right? And even just with the local file that you have, right? You don't really need a separate server application in order to handle this, because after all, JavaScript by itself can also set and read cookies, which means that it could be used in order to retrieve some amount of information. The problem is there is usually a sort of strict limit on the amount of data that can be stored. It is non-trivial. You can store probably several hundreds of kilobytes in cookies, right? Possibly even up to a megabyte or a little bit more than that, but not much more. So you can't really store documents or other significant chunks of information. Now, would you want to really store large amounts of information in local storage? That's a different question. What are the other issues that arise because of that? All of those also need to be considered. But the next thing that was brought up in order to sort of get past the limitations of cookies was to introduce this concept of something called local storage, right? And local storage is basically a API which is built into most modern browsers that gives you something like a key value storage system. Okay, so what's a key value storage system? It's like a dictionary in Python or an object in JavaScript. Essentially what you have is object of key equals value, right? And in the most general case, of course, the key and the value are strings, right? They could be numbers as well. Essentially, the key has to be an immutable object, but the value by itself could be anything. It could be another object, for example, right? And by having these kind of key value entries, right, you can build up fairly complicated forms of storage. Now, the problem is local storage by itself only allows very simple forms of key value stores. You can give a key and you can store a single value, right, which is basically a string of some kind. And if you have more complex objects that you want to store into your local database, you need to serialize them, right? And this serialization, right, is basically a process of taking a complex object and converting it into a serial output format, meaning that the entire set of characters that represent that object are laid out in a continuous string in such a way that they can then be read back and the object reconstructed from there. Now, JavaScript and JSON, right, get along very well, because after all, JSON was sort of originally designed for JavaScript, which means that there are 2 methods, stringify and parse, that help you to sort of do precisely this, right? You can take a complex object and stringify it, which means that it converts it into a string and serializes all the data inside it. Once you have done that, you can store it into local storage, right, as the value corresponding to some key. And when you want to read it back, you can read it and then use the json.parse in order to get back the original object. Okay, so local storage is quite a powerful concept, and we'll look a little bit more into that next. Okay, there is yet another form of storage which is called the IndexedDB. Okay, and IndexedDB is the most powerful of these forms of local storage, right? It is pretty much a full transactional database system, right? It is not quite an RDBMS in the sense that it does allow certain kinds of relationship type queries, but on the other hand, it's not really laid out as a column affixed with column store, right, which is what traditional database management systems like MySQL or Postgres are, right? Instead, IndexedDB is more an object-oriented JavaScript-based database. Object-oriented means that you essentially provide a key and you get back a value. So once again this key value concept comes in over there, right? But as you will see, you can sort of build fairly complex queries on top of that. IndexedDB is very powerful. We are not going to go into that in detail, but if you do find yourself in a situation where you need to store significant amounts of data, it is probably the most powerful and the best way of handling that local storage, right? The one thing to keep in mind over here is local storage is literally that, it is local, which means that it is local to the specific browser that you are using. So if I have Chrome and Microsoft Edge on the same machine, the local storage is specific to Chrome or to Edge. They cannot read each other's local storage, at least not easily, right? There may be some way of sort of copying files from one place to another, but it's not going to be straightforward, right? Which means that if your system crashes, or you need to reinstall the browser, or you need to delete the browser and do something fresh with it, or you install a new browser, you have lost your local storage, right? Or you at least cannot retrieve it easily. You'll need to go through some slightly non-trivial processes in order to do this, which means that local storage should be used with care. Like I said, maybe the offline versions of email, you could store a temporary copy over here, but with the understanding that the email which is present on the server is always the master copy, right? So as long as you take care of those issues and use your local storage wisely, it can actually give you a much better user interface, for the simple reason that accessing things from local storage is always going to be faster than going out over the network and fetching it from a remote server. Okay. So now let's look a little bit deeper into the local storage concept, and we'll look at a couple of examples from the Vue Cookbook. Okay. So local storage is part of what's called the Web Storage API, right? And as usual, the Mozilla Developer Network documentation has a lot of detailed information about it, right? Which, as we can see, you go to the MDN web docs, the Web Storage API gives you a lot of concepts and also examples of how to use it, right? It gives you about what is the kind of browser compatibility, private browsing, all kinds of information that is useful to know about how web storage works. In particular, there are two things that you need to understand. There is something called session storage, right, where you have a separate storage area for each given origin that's available for the duration of the page session. Okay. Now, what do we mean by duration of the page session? Basically, what we are saying is, as long as this page is open in this browser, right, that's considered one session. Now, let's say I reload the page, that's also okay. Or if I go to another tab and come back after a long time, I might find that it's the content in this has been sort of flushed out, but it gets restored by reloading the page. All of that is considered a single session. But the moment I go and close the tab or close this window, it means that I have ended that session, and whatever I had in session storage at that point is lost. Okay. Now, local storage does pretty much the same thing, but it persists even when the browser is closed and reopened. So let's say I close the tab, or I even close the browser, I switch off the machine, I come back after a while, once again reload the page, I'll find that whatever I had put into local storage remains in local storage. But I go to another machine or use another browser, go to the same web page, I will not find the same information, because local means local to that particular browser, right? So yeah, so we can see that the session storage ends with the session. It provides more storage than cookies. So in that sense, session storage is similar to cookies, right? Both of them sort of end with the session. The moment you close the browser, the cookies also are usually destroyed, right? There are certain kinds of persistent server-side cookies that may stay for longer, but otherwise they are usually session cookies and they are destroyed when the browser is closed. Local storage, on the other hand, persists across browser restarts. So let's look at some examples to understand this part a little bit better, right? And Vue.js, right, has a number of very good cookbook examples that you can use. And the cookbook examples are basically things that, as you can see over here on the left hand side, it basically talks about what is the purpose of the cookbook examples, right, and gives you a number of different simple but useful examples that are sort of common and things that you might come across in different contexts. Okay, and unlike the view documentation, which sort of focuses just on what is the meaning of a particular kind of operation or how to use a given function or how to use a different construct in view, in the case of the cookbook, they basically go through examples to sort of show you how certain things can be used, right. So client side storage, right, the example that they give is, something very simple, just create a model, right, a form, right, an input field. And in this case, what we are going to do is, usually what happens when I load a page, right, is that the whatever was in that input field is lost. But now I'm going to do something else and say that I will add a little bit of view code over here, right. I have a variable called name, and anytime this view application is mounted, right, if the local storage contains an element with the key name, I will take that value local storage.name and put it into this .name. Okay. So that happens when the view application is mounted, that is to say basically when I load the page. I also add a watcher, right, which says that anytime that name changes, take the new value of the name and store it into the local storage. Okay. So now this, what you see down here, right, these kind of rectangles are something called code pens, okay, and it's basically provided by codepen.io, which is a very interesting and useful website that allows you to share functional pieces of code, right. There are limits on what you can do, so you can't write a full-blown app, for example, on it. It's not going to keep it operational. But if you want to write a small piece of code that you want to demonstrate to someone else, it provides you the ability to, edit HTML, JavaScript, CSS, all of those, even do some kinds of basic compilation and so on if necessary, and finally run the code and actually have it as a live demo that can be seen by others, right, but with very limited kind of functionality usually. So what we have over here is, this code pen exists. What happens if I reload this page, right? I go up to the reload button and click reload. The entire page gets reloaded. You can see that there was a brief interval when something happened. Basically what was happening was this code pen was being refreshed. Okay. Now what happens if I type something in here, right? I just type my name or something like that. Okay. And what happens when I reload the page? Let's see. Now I find that even though I reloaded the page, my name has come back automatically. Now what actually happened over here? Because this was a watcher, right? Anytime I make a change in the name, immediately the local storage value gets updated. And anytime that I reload the page, the mounted function gets called, which means that the value from local storage.name gets pulled into this .name, right? Which is why I found that whatever I had typed in over there, even when I reloaded the page, came back exactly the way that I expected, right? Now what we can do as an example over here is, let's say that we open this in another browser. Right? So it's exactly the same thing but opened in another browser, and now you can see that, well, there is some problem with the rendering when I open it on Edge, but clearly the name is blank, right? So what if I type in Edge name over here, okay, and I reload this page? Okay, what happens is Edge name comes back, right? I even close Edge, right, so it's gone. I restart it once more and again go there and open the page. What do I expect to see? I find that yes, the name is very much over there. Why? Because it is now in the local storage of this particular browser. Let me go back to Chrome, and when I reload the page in Chrome, I find that the name remains as it is over here. Okay. Now you also know that Chrome has developer tools, right, which provide you with certain kinds of extra assistance in debugging. So let's look at what happens with the developer tools, right? We can actually open that and go to the application, And over here we have something called local storage, right? And in local storage, I find that there are three different things. Vuejs.org has some kind of local storage, codepen.io has some storage, but this embedded site that I have here was actually running on cdpn.io, right? And if I click there, I find that indeed there is a value called my name out there, right? And I can go and change this to something else, okay? And when I change it over here and I come back, I should find that the name has in fact changed to something. It did not automatically get updated because this is not reactive, right? It was just something that was there in local storage. It was changed directly at the backend, right? The Vue code, if you look at it, has no way of monitoring local storage as such. But when I reloaded the page, it ended up pulling in the data that was actually in the local storage and not what I had typed in last. And that is what ends up coming on your screen. Now, in the same way, that was a very trivial example. The moment anything changes, it immediately gets stored into the local storage. Now, maybe that's not what we always want, right? We want to give it a little bit more time. We would actually like it to sort of take a moment and say, okay, fine, let me finish entering all the data that I have. And once I'm satisfied with it, actually save it into local storage. So an example of that is a slightly more complicated form where I have two entries, right? There is an input with name and there is an input with age, right? And in this case, what it says is, once again, the mounted part, right, says if there was a name in the local storage, read it into this.name. And similarly, if there was an age in local storage, then read it into this.age. And now I have defined something called a persist function, right, which basically says local storage.name is this.name, local storage.age is this.age, and okay, it logs some message. But the important point is that I don't have a watcher, right? I'm not looking for changes in name or age. Instead, I have to explicitly click on this button persist, right, which will show up as save out here. Only then will it save the information, right? So now if I go down here and look at it, you notice that the something that I had for local name is still there, right? And let's say I change the name to 12, right? Or 22, right? And click on save. Fine, that information is there. I reload the page and it takes a moment to come back, but yes, it has the information there, right? But now let me try changing this to something. I change it to testing and I change the age to something else, 35. Now without clicking on save, I reload the page. What happens? It goes back to the old values that I had because it did not save until it's not going to save until I actually click on the save button, right? But if I do change it and if I make it this and click on 35, now when I reload the page, not only do I find that the name has changed over here, I also go up there and find that at the top of the page in the original basic example, the name has changed to testing. Right, because it's basically using local storage.name. So what's the purpose of all of this, right? I mean, essentially, as you can see, this is somewhat limited in capabilities. It provides you with nice features because effectively what you can do now is create an app where there is actually some kind of notion of persistence, right? To take the example of the weather application, I type in a set of cities that I'm interested in, it stores the names of all of those cities and it also stores the last updated time, right? Which means that anytime now when I load up the page again, it basically shows me last updated for each of those things and I can click update on each one of them or have something else that updates all of them at one shot. But more importantly, the list of cities that I'm interested in is retained. I can close the browser, shut down the machine, come back a day later, load it. It'll at least have the list of cities and all I need to do is refresh them. Okay, and a lot of other kind of local small applications can be built up in this way. If you think about it, you could have a complete to-do application, right, where all of your list of tasks to be done are stored in local storage, right? So you could close the browser, go away, come back, and yes, it still retains the information. Of course, the problem with that is it's not synced to a centralized server. You change your machine, you try reading it on the phone, doesn't work. Okay. But if you know, for example, that there's one browser where you are going to be using it consistently. Let's say it's even on the phone, right? Because mobile Chrome after all has exactly the same set of features in terms of what the JavaScript can do, right? It also has local storage, which means that I could have a small application that just stores all that information on my phone, and as long as I check it on the phone, everything is going to be okay. But if I need to send it to someone else or to share it with someone else, I'll have to think of some other way of doing it. Okay, so local storage is a very powerful but relatively simple concept, right? There are further expansions on this. In fact, Vue itself has a few different variants of it, as you can see at the bottom of this Cookbook page, right? And apart from that, if you want to store more information, there is IndexedDB, right? But at the end of the day, keep in mind that local means local, and if you want it to be shared across multiple browsers or multiple locations, it usually has to be pushed to some kind of a centralized server.